Hi everyone, I'm Mike, and this is the Sunday Art Show. So this week we're actually at a brand new location for the channel, and it's also my first time at this particular spot. This is a beach in Cornwall called Bedruthan Steps, and the steps are actually these gigantic rock formations which sit on the sand of the beach. And Bedruthan was supposedly a giant who used these huge rocks as stepping stones. That's the local legend anyway, but I think it's very much something from Victorian times to help impress the tourists. But nevertheless, here we go. We're sort of heading along the top of the cliff path here towards the beach. And we actually ended up spending around about an hour at the beach, and I didn't bring my art equipment on this particular trip because, as you'll see and hear later, it was very, very blustery, very, very windy. It would have been pretty much impossible to do outdoor artwork. But it's such an amazing location that what I thought I would do is over the coming weeks, I'll do 3, maybe even 4 or 5 different videos showcasing different aspects of this particular spot, because it really is incredible. I don't think I've ever been to a beach quite like this. And for me, it ranks, right up there in the top 3 most amazing beaches I've ever been to, I think, easily. So it's pretty cool. So you'll get a little bit of a taste of that today because you'll just get the view from the top of the cliff. And then in future videos, I'll show you actually what it's like down on the beach. And then you get a real sense of the scale of these huge rock formations. But this beach is also unique, at least to me, because when you arrive at the car park, they actually give you a leaflet telling you to be careful of all these different things. So the beach is very prone to getting cut off by the tide. So one of the things they do is they have the lifeguards, and when the tide is coming in, they actually go down and make sure the beach is clear. So if you do ever decide to visit, you must check the tide times, because otherwise you could travel for 2 or 3 hours to get here and then find that you're not allowed to access the beach at all. So here's our first glimpse of this amazing beach, and you can see these giant rocks. Now, it's difficult to get the scale of, so we're going to go in a bit closer, but each of those rocks is around about 200 feet high. And you'll see in a moment, there are some people on the beach, and that really gives you a nice sense of scale. But it's a pretty cool spot, I have to say, because you've got the waves crashing in like you do on all Cornish beaches. You've got the cliffs like you have on many Cornish beaches. But in addition, as I say, you've got these freestanding rock formations. And I don't know how well it's going to come across on camera, but the colours in the rocks on this particular day were just amazing. So here I'm starting to get a sense of the beach now. And off in the distance there, you can see some of the larger rocks, which are freestanding on the sand. And as I said, in future videos, we'll take you down onto the beach and we'll walk, in between those rocks, so you really get a sense of the grandeur of the place. It's really cool. So I'm just switching to my other camera now to give you hopefully a bit of a better look at the beach. And that footage will click in just a moment. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do quite a simple. Here we go. Here's the footage. So giving you a better look at the beach. So you can see somebody walking their dog. They're really tiny down there on the beach. Lovely reflections in the wet sand, and lots of different, almost metallic colours in the rocks, and obviously lots of greens from the grass and stuff as well, which grows on top of the rocks. So there's that person again, looking very tiny. And if you look at the foot of this next rock formation, those little dots at the bottom on the sand, they're people. So it really gives you a sense of scale of these rock formations. They really are huge. Now, what we're doing now is I'm back at home, and I thought I'd keep my reference this time up in the top left-hand corner. I thought it might be interesting for you to see how I go about simplifying what is, at first look at that reference photo. It's a very complex, not only composition, but there's a lot of different textures there as well. So in order to deal with that, one of the best ways I find is to keep things as simple as possible. So to that end, I'm using some mixed media paper. It's just A4 in size. And this is just going to be a preliminary study, a quick sketch to kind of form the composition for a painting that I'll do in the future. So I'm using a lamp black watercolour marker pen. And as you can see at the moment, what I'm doing is I'm just keeping things really simple, and I'm just blocking in the shapes without getting enticed or seduced by the texture and the detail. Just trying to keep things really, really simple as we begin to position both the cliffs and the freestanding rocks on the sand. Now, I've kept my horizon line very high in the composition, as it is in the reference photo, but for two reasons. One is the rock formation we've got here and the shape of the cliffs. They make for very, very complicated shapes. And, that for me, that's enough complexity. I don't really want to have to deal with sky as well. Although on this particular day, the sky was fairly uniform in colour. But you could imagine if you had a lot of clouds, it might make things overly complex. And then the second thing is, it really brings our focus onto the beach. And, really, I've just put that strip of sky in there to show that there is some sky, there is a horizon. But I want the viewer to look at this crazy arrangement of rocks and cliffs as we look down from the cliff top. So you can see in just a couple of minutes, by keeping things very simple, with the watercolour marker pen, I've laid out the basic shapes. And what I'm doing now is just taking a clean, damp brush. This is just a synthetic brush. It's 1/2 inch width. It's a nice flat brush. It's one of my older brushes. You'll have seen me use it many times in previous videos, but you can see it's a little bit frayed. And that can actually be advantageous because you get some nice little wispy bits when you start to move the paint around. So for the most distant cliff, top right, I've basically just blocked that in. I've just let as a solid. And what I'm doing with the cliffs, which are a little bit closer to us, is I'm putting in a little bit of texture, not too much, but the brush strokes for the second most distant cliff, they were more or less kept vertical. For the one I've just worked on and I'm working on now, I'm putting in some different directions. And these gradual increases in texture and detail and changes in direction of brush stroke, I'll do more and more as we move into the foreground, so it will help to create a sense of depth in our painting. What I did there was just add a little indication of the reflection in the wet sand of that triangular rock. Not the one I just did, but the one above it, which looks a little bit like a shark's fin. So next what we'll do is start working on the two main cliff formations in the foreground. And these things are the two big rocks which are closest to us. If it was not for the bottom right hand triangle of cliff top that we're actually standing on. So we're going to include more texture, more layers of paint, and a little bit more detail than we have done so far in the painting. So a good tip when you're doing landscapes or seascapes, I think, is to think of them in terms of almost like you have some scenery on stage. So if you have scenery on stage, then obviously you've got your backdrop that would be painted, and then you might have a couple of set pieces which are a bit closer, and then you might have the actual parts of the set that the actors interact with, which are closer still. And that layered approach is used in theatre to help create a sense or an illusion of a world which has more depth than the depth of the stage. And it's very similar when we paint seascapes or landscapes. So the most distant cliffs, as I mentioned earlier, I've kept as very simple coloured in shapes. The freestanding rocks, which are beyond the main cliffs, I've added a little bit more texture and a little bit of a reflection in the wet sand. And now, as I just mentioned, on these big rocks, we're starting to add a little bit more detail. Now, we don't want to add too much, certainly not for this quick sketch, but it just helps to create the illusion that these two big rock formations are closer to us than the other rocks off in the distance. So you can see that I've started to loosely indicate some of the crevasses and cracks, nooks and crannies in the rocks. And then I just kind of move those marks around with the brush to help sort of just describe some of the contours of the rock face. But now I've just started on the cliff top, and so I've put in the indication of some blades of grass. Going back to the big rock formation now, just sort of softening with that mark I put in on the right hand side, and using brushwork and mark making which helps to suggest the presence of the grass which grows on top of these rocks. So just tapping the bristles down on the paper. But now when I come over to the cliff face that I'm actually standing, or the cliff top that I'm actually standing on, For that nearby grass, I'm just using vertically upward sweeping brush strokes. I'm sorry if my voice is a bit croaky today, getting over a period of the flu, so that's why. So I do apologise if I croak here and there. But we're just moving the paint around again, and what we're going to do is build up some darker layers in this foremost corner in just a moment. But before we do that, we're just going to drag the wet brush through the line which shows where the water meets the sand, so to just sort of indicate that boundary, and also just brush in a couple of indications of the wet sand in the foreground. And then with the tiniest bit of paint left on my brush, I just putting in some horizontal brush strokes to suggest the waves rolling in from left to right. Back to the cliff top now. Having softened the marks I put down before, as I mentioned a moment ago, we're going to take a multi-layered approach for this section. I'm now going back in with the brush nib of the marker pen to indicate some quick shapes of some of the flowers which are growing there and some of the different blades of grass. And now I'm going back in with my brush again. So as long as you don't put too much water down, this little technique of the watercolour marker and a wet brush, it's actually quite flexible and really more expressive than you might think at first, because you can very quickly draw. You can also very quickly soften any mistakes you've made. You can move paint around to create tone, but you can also take a layered approach. As I say, providing you don't get the paper too wet, then it should dry fairly quickly, allowing you to put pen marks on top of what you've done already. What you want to avoid getting it too wet, because what you'll find is if you try to draw into the wet marks, then you could damage the paper, but also it seems to damage the nib of the pen a bit as well. Now what I'm just doing here is popping in some little drawings of people down at the rock face. I mentioned that earlier, and that really is going to help give our sketch a sense of scale. Now, if you didn't know they were people, you might not realise they were people the way I've drawn them because they are so small. But for me, when I come back and work this into a finished painting, this simple sketch is going to help remind me how to structure my painting and what I need to convey in terms of scale, detail, sense of depth, which are the most important bits that I want to draw, even though I'll end up using more colour and more detail and taking much more time on the finished painting. I can refer to this simple sketch, and hopefully it's going to make my life a lot easier in the long run. So what I'm doing now is just using the fine tip to put in another layer of detail on top of what I did previously. So we're up to our third or fourth layer of paint here, fourth layer of mark making. So again, it really helps to bring this cliff top towards us and hopefully helps create a sense of depth within the sketch, because as you probably know, if you use colour, you can use more bluey colours for the distance and warmer colours for the foreground. But we're just working with basically black and grey and white, so we have to use other techniques, change the detail and things like that. So at this stage, I just decided I needed a little bit more tone on the top of those two big rocks, just to help distinguish between the areas with grass on and the areas of bare rock. And that's this little sketch getting close to completion now. So as I say, what I'm looking forward to showing you in the next couple of videos, maybe not next week or the week after, but at some point in the future, the next couple of videos where we come back to Bedruthan, is I'll show you different aspects of this particular beach. There's the finished sketch, but I'll also use different techniques. So I'll perhaps do some line and wash work in colour to capture a different view, or do a fully worked up acrylic painting of a different view again. But hopefully I'll be able to show you different stages of my creative process for doing these seascapes. But let me just leave you with a couple of little snippets of what's to come in future weeks. So I hope you really enjoyed this video. Thanks very much for watching. As always, if you've got any questions, then please remember to ask me in the comments below. Please remember to hit the like button, and if you're new here, please remember to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. But in the meantime, I look forward to seeing you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show. Thanks very much for watching.